Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first ILSI meeting. Hopefully it's the first of many to come in the future. So I do a couple different things. I'm a criminologist, and I also am a forensic document examiner. So to begin with, before I get into what I'm going to talk about today, I thought that I would just begin by a brief introduction of what we do at the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State. We focus on prevention. That's what we do, mainly strategy and policy. We don't do any kind of testing. We don't have any equipment set up to do that. So our focus is on strategy and policy on how to prevent food fraud. Specifically, areas that I'm working in, I'm doing research in the area of question documents, looking at how documents in the food industry and the food supply chain can be falsified or manipulated in some way. Also looking at intelligence analysis. This is a new area of research for us that we're working on. This is real important because when I get done with the talk today, what you'll see is that the best way to prevent food fraud is information. And not all information or data sources are treated equal. So how do we know when we're getting information if that information is good? What's the quality of it? Because at the end of the day, someone's got to make a decision on where to put resources, and prevention programs can get expensive. So with intelligence analysis, the idea is that we'll be able to come up with a strategy on how to assess the quality or quantity of information you need to make that decision. We also have, we're academics. So we do research, teaching, and outreach. So we have what we call massive online courses, or MOOCs. These are free, open, and online. Anyone in here can sign up and take these courses. A variety of different food fraud topics, and they're offered throughout the year. We also offer executive education. These are short courses, about a week long in length. They're offered at MSU or on site anywhere in the world. We have graduate courses in food fraud. We have about 5. So if you're interested in taking graduate coursework, you can do that. And if you're interested in getting a certificate in that, we offer that too. And then if you're taking the courses and you really like them, you could consider doing a Master of Science in Food Safety. All of this stuff can be done online. Anyway, for more information, foodfraud.msu.edu. You can sign up for our newsletter too, which keeps you up to date on the things that we're doing, research that's coming out, and so on. Okay. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. I'm going to first begin by introducing the food fraud concept. Some of you may be more familiar with this than others. So I'm going to begin with that introduction. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the problem, and then I'm going to discuss the criminology behind the food fraud prevention that we focus on. Because unlike other food safety, food quality issues, food fraud is based on a human actor, not a microbe. And so that's where criminology really comes in to play. And then I'm going to end my discussion with the role of science and technology in all this. And by the way, as I go through these things, you'll probably be thinking of different ways that different technology things may be used in a prevention process. But the key here really is prevention, and that's what I'm going to focus on, because science and technology, or the technology that can be used, can only take us so far. So basically, food fraud is deception using food for economic gain. Now that sounds simple, but it's really a broad concept. It's much broader than that. The motivation is economic gain, and the effect, there's generally two effects to this. There's the economic threat. A company can go out of business because of food fraud. It can be a huge economic impact for your brand. And then there's the public health threat. We call it a vulnerability. More often than not, a food fraud incident, there really is no public health issue there. If you take legitimate food out of the supply chain, stick it back in the supply chain, it may be completely fine. There's issues with that. There's vulnerabilities because we don't know how it's being handled. So we don't know what the bad guys are doing with it. But in many cases, if you dilute something or you add something, oftentimes there's really not a public health threat there, but there's always a vulnerability if something can happen. And that's really key with that. So what does food fraud include? So traditionally, been interested mainly in with adulteration or things that are going to be adulterated food or adulterated substances. That's traditional focus on it, but food fraud really is much more than that. It incorporates a variety of things. Again, it's deception using food for economic gain. So that would include counterfeiting, that would include tampering, mislabeling, overruns. Again, the gray market products, taking things out of the legitimate supply chain and slipping it back in. Now again, the public health threat on that can be low, but the vulnerabilities are there. There's two issues, right, with gray market goods. One is we don't know what the bad guys are doing with it. They could be mishandling it. Through that mishandling, there could be spoilage. There could be a variety of other things. The other issue with that is that when you take something out of the supply chain, you slip it back in, that means there's a lack of transparency in your supply chain and there's opportunities there for someone to go in and do that. And if there's opportunities there for someone to go in and take something out and slip something in, then there's opportunities for other things like counterfeiting and so on, which could increase the risks or the hazards that are involved. So this up here just gives you an idea. This is essentially globally what we look at food fraud as, all of these things combined. The biggest health risks are probably going to be with your counterfeiting and your adulterations or adulterated substances that you're going to see. Those are where you're going to see your biggest health risks, but obviously in any of these other areas you could too. So let's step back a moment and take a look at where food fraud is in relation to other categories here. Now, food fraud's been with us for a very long time. It's not a new thing. Since the beginning of commerce, there's been food fraud issues. We know with counterfeiting too, that going way back in time to when humans could actually reason and think they're probably getting one over on someone else. And so although we don't have a written record of all the food fraud that's ever happened in history, and something like that would never be created for obvious reasons, but it's been with us for a long time. So it's interesting that it wasn't until 2011 when really the food fraud concept was first defined in the academic literature, and then we started to get this push and interest in talking more about it. For a very long time, what we'd consider food fraud, or how we defined it and how we just looked at it, would be lumped in with food defense or some of these other areas. But we think it's very distinct and a separate area on its own. So one way to think about it is the food fraud protection risk matrix. So you have these four areas here: food safety, food quality, food fraud, and food defense. So any issue you have, you can think about the action and the motivation. Once you understand the action and the motivation, you know where the issue would fall on this matrix here. Of course, a food defense issue would be someone intentionally putting food in the supply chain for harm, a disgruntled employee who wants to hurt the business in some way. Food safety issue would be like E. coli, listeria, something along those. Food quality, bruised, damaged fruit, and then of course food fraud would be what I just talked about. So here's how you can look at this. If you look at the left-hand side of this, food quality and food safety are unintentional acts. The action there is unintentional. No one, whatever your food safety or food quality issue, there was no human component to that was intentionally trying to do that. On the right-hand side of that, with food fraud and food defense, you can see that the action's intentional. Someone's intentionally doing something with the food. And what's their motivation? If their motivation is economic and it's intentional, it's a food fraud issue. If the motivation is terror, harm in some way, and it's intentional, it's a food defense issue. So how big is this problem? This is always the question, right? Everyone, when looking for funding or looking for ways to prevent or alleviate a problem, we always want to know how big it is. Well, with like all other transnational crimes, we don't know. The nature of the frauds, the nature of the crimes make it practically impossible to get a number on how big the problem is. Why? A lot of it goes undetected. So we don't really know. Like with a counterfeit medicine, for example, if you take a counterfeit medicine, you have cancer, you take a counterfeit medicine and you end up dying, Did you die because of the medicine was counterfeit, or did you die because of the cancer? Oftentimes you diagnose as dying from the disease when in fact it could be something else. So it's very hard to quantify a lot of these things. But estimates here are 30 to 40 billion annually lost to food fraud. A single fraud incident can cost 2 to 15% of a company's annual revenue. So it's a significant problem. And then it's like, well, if we can't measure it or we don't know how big the problem is, then should we even address it? Well, here's the thing. And for the remainder, most of the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about the criminology and crime prevention and how we would look at that and how we would address it. But here's the thing. With this large, complex supply chains, as fast as food is moving around the world, and with the globalization of the supply chain and everything else, there are numerous opportunities for fraud and for crime at any given moment. Therefore, there are things happening. There's things that we know that there's incidents because we have incident database that show this. But to the true size, we're not going to ever really get at. But we know that the problem is there. It's going to grow. It's going to get bigger. When you think about now with food going online, right? There's a big push to Amazon.com, other companies, food going online. I'm telling you, a whole lot of new opportunities coming up for food fraud right there alone. We already see that with counterfeit goods and other products being sold on eBay and other sites, any kind of these online marketplace. So as food goes online, new opportunities for fraud is going to come up, and we should be ready to start thinking about what kind of countermeasures and how we're going to be able to look and assess those vulnerabilities. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, we manage it through detection, deterrence, and prevention. That's really going to be the key here. Always ask yourself, are we disrupting the chemistry of the crime? And I'm going to explain in a moment what that chemistry of crime looks like. But we first detect, and this is where our technology comes into place. We got to be able to detect it. We lead with technology. And then we deter. This is important. If you detect melamine or in milk, or you detect horse meat in beef, like in the UK, it's important to let the bad guys know we can detect that, we can find it. Because once they know that you have a good test for melamine, they're going to stop using melamine to put into milk. Because why? You're going to get caught. So they're going to try to find something else to use instead. There's no point in detecting something if you're going to keep it to yourself and you're not going to let the bad guys know you can test it. Because at the end of the day, detection doesn't equal prevention. Remember that. Detection does not equal prevention. You could still get hit. If you can detect it and you're still getting hit all day long by the bad guys, you haven't done anything. The goal here is to prevent, not detect it, not catch it, not make a lot of arrests. The idea here is to prevent, and that's the last point, and that will always be our goal. An example from honey example here. So this honey company had some suspicious activity. The product was, they were taking bids, and they were getting really low bids on some. So they had suspicion that maybe someone was doing something with the honey. So what they did was they sent out a survey to the manufacturers and suppliers asking about food fraud, just a survey inquiring. After they sent out the survey, they took bids, and 50% of the people that bid before didn't bid. And two Lithuanians who were suspected or whatever didn't place a bid that time around. And the idea is, like, do you think that was because they thought you were looking for fraud? It's like, don't know. But sometimes it's that easy, it's that enough. If the bad guys know that you may be looking, then they may just decide that it's too risky. I'm going to go try to do this somewhere else, or I'm just not going to do it at all. So getting a word out can be helpful. So what do we do about it? Well, if the agent is a microbe, you naturally go to a microbiologist. But with food fraud, the agent's a human being, so naturally you go to criminology and say, what can we do about this? Because really, at the end of the day, it's a human actor who's making decisions and putting things into the supply chain or manipulating food in some way for economic gain. So this is the focus of what I do. This is the focus of what we do at the Food Fraud Initiative. Generally, criminology tends to explain crime causation, why crime occurs. And I don't know how familiar you are in the field of criminology, but there are a lot of criminological theories on why people commit crimes. Many of these theories have to do with background characteristics, and so on, criminal dispositions, things that would push an individual towards crime, why that can be. But what a lot of these traditional criminology theories do is they kind of remove the idea that the criminal has a mind and actually thinks and is a rational actor. It's not just all the background characteristics. We're thinking. People are thinking all the time. We think all the time. And a crime is a series of steps. It isn't just one moment. It's a series of steps from planning, what's the target, what am I going to do to get the target, after I hit the target, what am I going to do? There's a series of thought processes that go into that. And to ignore that, I think, is a big mistake. And a lot of the traditional crime theories have done that. However, crime science, which came about in the early 1970s, actually kind of looked at it differently, and this is what we call our environmental crime theories or our crime prevention theories. And these theories focused more on the crime situation, not the individual. We're not worried about trying to change the criminal disposition of people. It's an impossible task, and even if we were able to change that in people, it would take generations to kick in. So the best way to prevent or to address a crime issue is through understanding the environment, understanding the situation, manipulating that environment in some way to make the crime a bad choice, and therefore make the criminal decide, rationally thinking, decide, I'm not going to do it, it's too risky, I might get caught. And so that's where crime science comes in and goes, look, if we can focus on specific crime problems in a very focused way, then what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to reduce crime immediately and dramatically. And there's been hundreds of papers that have been researched in this area of crime science that have shown that it worked very well, albeit many of those on street crimes, robbery, theft, burglary, but we believe it can be applied to food fraud here. The main theories that support this is routine activities theory, and I'm not going to go over these in any great detail, one, because I don't have a lot of time, and some of it may just not be that relevant. But with routine activities theory, the idea here is that every day we have basic routines. Originally it was created to try to figure out crime trends in the United States. Why is crime rates going up and down? And what they found was it wasn't so much about people, it was just the routine activities changed. 40 years ago, burglary was a crime that happened at night, right? The burglar coming in a window. And then over time, it completely changed to where it happens during the day. Why do you think that is? Well, everyone's working now. Once men and women went to work, the houses were empty, the criminals go, that's when we hit it, not at night. And so it completely changed by a change in the routine activities of our normal everyday lives. And so that's where this theory comes in, which underlies pretty much the whole crime prevention strategy we have. So you need 3 ingredients, just like baking a cake. If you want a crime, you need certain ingredients for it to happen. You need a motivated offender, you need a suitable target, and you need, in the absence of a capable guardian. If these 3 things come together in time and space, which is illustrated by these 3 circles here, then crime is more likely. Not guaranteed, because at the end of the day, the criminal still has to make the decision to go through with it. But if you have those ingredients, then crime is more likely. Crime pattern theory is more interested in how criminals go around finding crime opportunities in these daily routines of everyday life. How do I find crime opportunities? And that's what that's interested in. And then rational choice gets into the fact of how we make decisions, that criminals are rational actors and they do think things through and they think things out. So the crime triangle down here in the right-hand corner is a way to think about this, and this is how I would suggest that when you're thinking about crime problem or looking for vulnerabilities, or if you know you have an incident, this is how you start gathering information and thinking about it. Because once you have all of this information, then you can start thinking about countermeasures on how to prevent it. So here we have your offender, your motivated offender. Your suitable target is the bottom, and we're talking about the middle triangle, and then the place of crime. And the outside triangle these are what we call controllers or handlers. So a handler over an offender could be a parent, if it's a juvenile, right? A manager over a place could be anyone who works at a business or manufacturing plant, and a guardian over a target could also be that too. So you can start to see here that if you can understand the elements of crime, then you can manipulate any of these. And if you can manipulate these things, then you can reduce your crime opportunity. And at the end of the day, we want to reduce our crime opportunities to get to a solution. And so you must analyze and understand these. So what I want to do now is I want to give you an example. A very famous one. The reason why I like using this one is because we know a lot about it. A lot of food fraud incidents, there's not a lot of information available publicly, or if you do get information, it's one of those things where you're not supposed to be releasing it to the public. So this is just a good one to illustrate. Plus, I find that audience tend to know a lot about this one. So, for example, the horse meat and beef problem in Europe. This is how you would start to think about, well, what are the problems here? So if you identify the place of the crime, 14 companies throughout the European Union, 9 different countries. You look at who the offenders were. You look at what the targets were, consumers, governments, companies, and then you look at what the guardians are. And guardians, again, these could be anyone who would be overseeing those controllers we talked about. They could be police officers, they could be managers, they could be employees, they could be neighbors, they could be anything along those lines. So you get all of this information, and then once you have that information, you start looking at, well, how did they do this? Where was the opportunities? And once you identify those opportunities and you go, this is where we need to start thinking about what countermeasure we can get so this doesn't happen again and we can prevent it. And so what they came up with, and I didn't write down everything, I just pulled out 4 here, is that to prevent this from happening, an improved horse identification system in Europe, mandatory country of origin labeling for horse meat, mandatory CCTV cameras inside slaughterhouses, and then they created an agreement between the countries where only horses of high health could be transported without documents and these health certificates and things. So then you look at that, and what I want to do is I just want to focus on these 2 for a moment. And when you think about that, it's like, yeah, okay, that's going to help. That's going to solve a big part of our problem. But what are opportunities here, right? So this is a dynamic process when you're thinking about crime prevention. You don't stop once you think you solve the problem. You keep monitoring and looking for what your vulnerabilities are. You're always doing vulnerability assessments of these things. Well, looking at it after the fact, counterfeit and forged horse passports were being targeted by the fraudsters. So what they said, oh, we need passports? No problem, right? Then what we'll do is we'll just create fake passports, put them with low-valued horses or whatever, and then we can move them that way, right? Now, me as a document examiner, this was an obvious thing for me, but not necessarily everyone would consider that, right? So, U.S. passports, highly secure documents, correct? Right? Really secure. It'd be crazy for someone to try to counterfeit a passport. There's an easier way to do this, right? So how does one obtain a fake identity document or horse passport? So I'm going to first show you how you get a fake identity document, not in great detail, but generally. That's a different talk. That's a different talk. And then I'm going to show you how you get a fake horse passport using a similar process. So, birth certificates are the main identity document. Most birth certificates have no security features. None at all, in fact. There's roughly 6,400, that number could change. This is based on a document produced by the Department of Health and Human Services. 6,400 birth certificate issuing agencies in the United States. And there's over 14,000 different versions of birth certificates in the United States. So if you're in Iowa at an issuing agency, and I come in with a birth certificate from Florida, and there's 60 different versions in Florida, how do you know whether it's real or not? And there's no security features on it. Trust. You just accept it at face value. So it'd be very easy for me to counterfeit the birth certificate, get a legitimate driver's license with it, get a legitimate social security card with it, then use those documents to get my passport. The passport is completely authentic, has all the security features, would pass any test, but all the information on it is completely fake. So the opportunity is actually in the issuance process and identity verification of the individual, not downstream at the identity doc. In fact, the 9/11 Commission report stated that the September 11 terrorists had multiple valid driver's licenses from different states. How did they get them? There you go, right there. That's how you do it. Now, if you're a good guy and you're an honest person, you're not going to do this, but we're not worried about the good people. We're worried about the bad people, what they're thinking about, not what we're thinking about. So how do you do this with a horse? So you have your horse, and then you have this identification thing. So a veterinarian or someone would come along, and they would take this, and they would say, oh, he's got this white marking on the face, he's got a scar on his leg, and they would fill this out. In addition to that, you would have a book of records of vaccinations, health, all these things, signed and done by a veterinarian or whatever. Once you have that, you now have an ID. And so now that you have your horse's ID, you get a little microchip that you could put into the horse, and that microchip is going to contain what? The identification card and the vaccination and shot record. And then after you do that, voila, you get yourself a horse passport. So where's the opportunity here? Fake the horse passport? No, fake the identification card or the shot records or whatever, and then attach it to a horse. Now this can become valuable, right, if you have a low quality horse and you're trying to sell it as a high quality horse, or you're trying to use low quality horses, because in Europe they eat horse meat, and you're going to use that for horses there for consumption. Well, what if the low quality horses have some kind of drug or something in it that's bad for humans? Here's the thing with food fraud. The big danger with it is we don't know what the bad guys are doing. That's why prevention is important. What are we going to detect? We don't know what we're looking for. That's why prevention is so important here, is because we don't know. Fortunately, in the horse meat and beef issue in Europe, they used high quality horse meat. And so there was no public health issue with it. But what if they didn't? We wouldn't have been able to track it or trace it in any way because we didn't know it was in there. We didn't know to look at beef for horse meat. And that's where the problem is. That's where the vulnerability is that we don't know what the bad guys are doing with it. So situational crime prevention is the applied aspect of all of this that I just got into talking about. So what does it mean? So your problems must be specifically and accurately defined. Food fraud as a concept is too broad. If you try to solve your food fraud problem by identifying it as food fraud, that's too broad. Because food fraud is what? Counterfeiting, smuggling, adulteration. Well, horse meat and beef is too broad. You need to get more focused. Horse meat and beef in Europe, and some would even argue horse meat, beef in Europe in specific country and specific place. Because only by getting that focus and those details can you identify where the opportunity was, where the problem was, and what countermeasure you can use to combat it. So the process must be data-driven. Prevention programs can be very expensive, and what you don't want to do is you don't want to be throwing money at something that doesn't work because you're not getting at the real issue. So you've got to get information, as much information as you can, and find out what those opportunities are. Again, this is all about focus. Too many crime problems, too many programs are unfocused, and they don't lead to any good results. As many of you in here know, if you do unfocused research, it doesn't lead to very good results. So this is about focus, and you must continue this assessment. After you come up with a countermeasure, continuously assess, because what the bad guys might do is find, like with the horse passport, fine, we need a passport, we can get a passport. And so now you got to keep this ongoing. Again, detect, deter, prevent. We're not trying to catch the product. We're not trying to arrest our way to preventing food fraud. We're trying to prevent it. And so what's the role of science and technology in this? And as you can see going throughout this presentation, that there's different avenues where technology can be used. Track and trace technology is great because it gives us those eyes that when you're not there, it puts what we would call, say, eyes on a street. And if someone thinks they're being watched, they're less likely to do something wrong. You reduce an opportunity. That's where track and trace is helpful in that sense. Authentication is one of the most challenging parts of what we do because with food fraud, we don't know what we're trying to test for, and it becomes difficult. But we cannot test our way to safety, and we will not arrest our way to prevention. It's not like there's only 10 food fraudsters in the world, and if we get 8 of them, we're on our way. Literally everyone along your supply chain, anyone you hire, is potentially someone who could be committing food fraud. In fact, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners say that internal theft is the #1 way businesses lose money. Do you know who's working for you? You want me to go back to the passport slide? No, really, you really need to consider who's working for you and who you're hiring when you do this. The goal is not to catch food fraud, but to prevent it. Key here, we're not trying to catch it. We're trying to prevent it. You catch it, it's too late. And start with one or more simple countermeasures and control strategies, and this is going to be based on what you're able to obtain. If you have some kind of suspicion, like the honey company, and they sent out a little fraud survey, and then 50% of their people putting in bids, suppliers, decided they weren't going to do it that year after they got the survey, wow, you just successfully did something for very little money, right? Develop specific and advanced technologies as needed. So as we go along, and again, with the online marketplace and food being sold online, we're getting to a point now where all sorts of new opportunities and things that we probably didn't even imagine could come up. So always be thinking like a criminal. Try to think like, if I wanted to hit my company or hit this, how might I do it? And again, the key is that crime triangle I threw up here with the chemistry of the crime. So I have a food document fraud survey that's ongoing. If you want to take that, go ahead. It's very short. Again, I'm looking at what kind of documents and things that you may be encountering or concerned about fraud, and trying to develop this area of research and looking at how some prevention strategies may be used. And with that, I'm going to open up to questions for the remaining time, and I'll be here throughout the day, so if you have anything, I'd be more than happy to meet everyone here and chat, so let me know. But thank you.
Actually, I have a question. I'm just curious, Dr. Fenoff, so Jason Luca, Kraft Heinz. I'm just curious, like, what keeps you up at night? I mean, a lot of times for those of us in the industry who are in this area, we're often challenged by some of our management to say, you know, what should I be worried about? How do you forecast into the crystal ball? But I'm just curious, you know, what keeps you up at night?
Well, I teach a class on transnational crime and human trafficking, illegal drugs, illegal arms, humans are kind of crappy people, you know. We do horrible things. I tell you, no, I trust no one. You know, I become more paranoid as I study these things and I learn. I trust no one. I generally like people, but everyone I've met here, I like very much, by the way. I like very much. No, I'm just very skeptical of everything. My students say after they take my transnational crime class, they said they're never going to go online again. They're never going to eat out again. They're never going to, you know, we got on a list of things. It's like, no, it's just awareness of what's going on, that there are bad people out there trying to do things. And the more we know and the more we can think about how to protect ourselves and prevent is the way to go. But one of the big things, and I was talking about this earlier, is the organics market. I'd be very concerned with, I asked my students this question, what is the difference between an organic tomato and an inorganic tomato? Now there's the definition, right, in the law, but then there's this one, the sticker, right? It's the sticker. To the consumer, it's the sticker. They have to have trust that those products are going through a secure supply chain and everyone's doing their job right. The thing is that oftentimes the food fraud or other things that are happening are from people that are already in that supply chain that work for you, you know, and so I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, I sleep okay just because I guess I'm used to it. I don't know, but
thank you.
I'm just very skeptical. Yeah.
Maha Tahiri from General Mills. Does this work? Okay. I know you mentioned e-commerce, but my question is about, have you seen any increase with all these cyber attacks and all of that? Have you seen any increase in the nature of some food frauds or food crimes that is really linked to the cyber system, and that are through that medium versus the old system?
No, and here's why. Because we really don't have a base. We can't determine if something's increasing or decreasing unless we know what our base is. So it's like we don't know what the level of food fraud online is. So it's hard to determine. If we don't know, but all of a sudden there's a bunch of media reports of food fraud. That doesn't mean it's increasing. That just means we're aware of it and we may be catching it now. The thing is we know that there's opportunities, and the opportunities are growing. And if we have a lot of opportunities, then fraud is more likely, right? And so based on that, you can start thinking about, well, as we go online and we're doing this quickly, then the opportunities for fraud are greater. Then you could see more people coming into that marketplace and exploiting it. So in that way, you could say, probably the more we go online, the more we do this, then there's going to be more fraud taking place there. But as for a number, it's very hard to get at a lot of these crimes because we don't know what zero is. You know, we don't know what our base is. That's why you got to be careful with any numbers dealing with any of these types of crime. Sometimes you'll get these huge numbers, like I think counterfeiting, at one point, product counterfeiting, it had a number over 500 billion. It's like, where does that come from? How do you know that? So it's difficult, but the opportunities are there. Hi.
Hi, Jeff Patton from FDA, CIFSAN. Being scared can be fun. That's why we go to scary movies. And I want to compliment the organizers. This is a great way to start this meeting off, I think. It's extraordinarily timely. There's a breaking story about Spanish horse meat in beef, over 100 arrests, and they moved the microchips. They switched microchips from healthy slaughters to other ones. It's a brilliant example, I think. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, and you know, and thanks for bringing that up, because see, that's another thing to think about. You know, we got this technology, right? We got microchips, so we can do this, and we think, we figured it out, and then that's not even something that takes a lot of sophistication if you think about it. Oh, we just move it from here to here, and we're done. Successful at it. Yep.
Yeah, Josh Anthony, Campbell Soup Company. I was really interested in your talk about, well, we're not going to eliminate criminal behavior. You know, if somebody's going to be a criminal, they're wired that way, we focus on the environment. I'm always interested in terms of how different disciplines think about things, right? On the nutrition side of things, when we're thinking about like weight loss, we're always talking about, okay, behavior and environment and, you know, how do we get the right mix? Just curious in your perspective in terms of sort of applying that philosophy to other areas. Are we over-focused on individual behavior and should be thinking more about a healthy environment? Or, you know, are there lessons learned that could be applied into other nutrition problems we're trying to solve?
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of a holistic approach to a lot of things and bringing other fields and disciplines. In fact, at the Food Fraud Initiative, it started out food scientists and packaging, have expanded into business, enterprise risk management, criminology. And you bring all these things together and you bring the different way of viewing the world and a different way of looking at things. And sometimes the ideas that are just generated from that, you know, it's like, whoa, I never really thought about it. Because you're trained, you know, when you go through college for a very long time, like many in here have done that, you're trained to think a certain way. If you're a criminologist, you're trained to think like a criminologist. If you're a nutritionist, you're trained to think like a nutritionist. So it's good to bring those different perspectives into play. But yeah, focusing on the environment is huge. I think that's the way, at least with food fraud, how you go about it. What are your thoughts with nutrition on?
Well, I think that you have to separate out a little bit whether or not you're looking at a situation that's potentially punitive or preventative, right?
Yes.
Versus something that versus something that has a reward component to it. And I think that aspect from an individual behavior and choice standpoint is something that stands apart if we're looking at something in terms of food behaviors, right? Because
Yes.
food can be a good, you know, could and probably should be both a good and a bad thing. So I don't know that, like, I'm saying this without data in hand,
Yeah.
but I don't know that something that would strictly focus on an environment would be a robust solution if we're thinking about, say, combating obesity.
Yeah, I understand. I guess, yeah, another way to think about it is that when you focus on the environment, you're also thinking about risk reward. You're also trying to manipulate the behavior of the individual. Focus is on the environment, but you're also trying to manipulate. So if you make the risks higher than a reward, then a rational actor will do what? Do something else. If you make the reward higher than the risk, you know. And so that's what we're trying to do with food fraud prevention. And so maybe in nutrition, a similar thing is understanding the environment the person lives in, but how can we make their choices more risky or more rewarding depending on how we do it. So there's both there. There's both components. I agree, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Teresa Davis from Baylor College of Medicine. You were implying that there's a greater risk of food fraud from more online sales of food and so forth. Could you explain how that increases the possibility of food fraud?
Okay, so maybe just to clarify, just so that I understand. If I don't understand, please correct me. But not so much saying that there's more risk online, saying that as a new platform in the online world, like 10 or 15 years ago, internet online crime wasn't even something we really thought about. And nowadays, it's like there's all sorts of new crimes that have come about because of the internet and online that we now have to think about. And that's that routine activities where societal changes create different opportunities for crime. So I'm just forward thinking that as we start shipping, selling, people, instead of going down to their grocery store, they just click and it comes to their door, that there's going to be a whole different opportunities for crime there. Now, will there be more fraud online than outside? I don't know. Again, it's very hard to get at. It just depends on how society changes and what those opportunities are. Wherever the opportunities are going to be, there's going to be someone trying to exploit it. And so you always want to try to figure out, how do we reduce the fraud opportunity? Always think that way. How do I reduce the fraud opportunity? Is what I am doing reducing the fraud opportunity or increasing the fraud opportunity?
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Fenoff.
Thanks. Yeah.